There's a rhythm to history, a cycle that rises quietly beneath the surface, and then, all at once, tears entire nations apart. It's a pattern that has toppled empires, shattered monarchies, and rewritten the destiny of millions. And today, in 2025, the United States is moving through that same sequence, step by step, pressure by pressure, almost as if we're watching a familiar play unfold, one whose script was written long before we were born. In 1789, France was the jewel of Europe, wealthy, cultured, enlightened. 5 years later, the king was dead, the streets ran red, and 40,000 people were condemned in the frenzy of the terror. In 1917, Russia was a colossal empire stretching across continents. 8 months after the first uprising, the Romanovs were executed and the Bolsheviks seized power, plunging the nation into a civil war that swallowed 20 million lives. In 1959, Cuba was a tropical showcase of prosperity, tourism booming, money flowing, the future bright. Within 2 years, Fidel Castro stood atop a communist dictatorship that would dominate the island for 6 decades. 3 nations, 3 revolutions, 3 governments that believed they were too strong to fall. And every single one of them was wrong. What's chilling is not that these countries collapsed, it's that they collapsed the exact same way. Extreme inequality, corrupt leadership, a betrayed middle class, a breakdown of trust, radical movements rising from the margins, and finally, a plunge into chaos no one could control. These weren't isolated events. They were steps in a process. And right now, every warning sign from those revolutions, every pressure point that cracked the foundations of France, Russia, and Cuba is present in the United States. The wealth gap, the polarization, the collapsing trust in institutions, none of it is theoretical anymore. We're not drifting toward the sequence. We're already deep inside it. Before we walk through that pattern, before we confront the stages that history says come next, you need to understand what a revolution truly is. It's not a protest. It's not a riot. It's not even a hostile election. A revolution is what happens when the old order doesn't simply weaken. It disappears. When a society's expectations outrun its reality. When the social contract snaps, when people stop believing the system can fix itself. And as President John F. Kennedy warned decades ago, those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. History has proven him right 3 times, 3 nations, 3 centuries apart. Let's look at how the pattern unfolded, and why so many believe we're standing at the edge of it once again. If the claim is that revolutions follow a recognizable pattern, then France in 1789 is where that pattern first crystallizes into something unmistakable, a blueprint written before anyone knew they were drawing one. Having established that revolutions emerge when expectations exceed reality and institutions lose legitimacy, the text naturally turns to the case that defines the archetype. The French Revolution, the mother of modern political upheaval. And it is here that we see the pattern not as an abstract theory, but as a living sequence unfolding with tragic clarity. In the 1,780 seconds, France seemed untouchable. Paris was the cultural heartbeat of Europe. The monarchy was ancient and ornate, and French power radiated across the continent. Diplomacy, philosophy, art, cuisine, France dominated them all. To outside observers, it looked like the pinnacle of civilization. But revolutions rarely start where outsiders are looking. They begin in the fault lines beneath the marble floors, in the stresses no one in the palace wants to acknowledge. And beneath France's brilliance lay a society balanced on a powder keg of inequality. The 3-estate system was a hierarchy so lopsided it is astonishing it survived as long as it did. The clergy and nobility, barely more than 1% of the population, owned over a third of the land and paid almost nothing in taxes. Meanwhile, the Third Estate carried the kingdom on its back. Peasants, enduring starvation-level subsistence, workers crushed by rising prices, and an increasingly educated middle class suffocating under a political structure designed to exclude them. Bread, the lifeblood of the French diet, consumed nearly 90% of a peasant's budget. A single bad harvest could turn hunger into desperation. And yet, at Versailles, the aristocracy lived in a dream world of banquets and luxury, insulated from the despair erupting across the country. Inequality was not just economic, it was theatrical, flaunted, and enraging. Government failure accelerated the collapse. King Louis XVI was not malevolent. He was simply outmatched by the moment. Drowning in debt, much of it incurred helping the American Revolution achieve the freedom France's own citizens lacked, the monarchy had no coherent plan except borrowing more and taxing those with the least ability to pay. His attempts at reform were blocked by elites who cared more about preserving privilege than saving the nation. France didn't just have inequality, it had a ruling class actively preventing solutions. When Louis summoned the Estates General in 1789 to resolve the financial crisis, he unknowingly lit the fuse. The Third Estate refused to accept its traditional, powerless role. Instead, its members declared themselves the National Assembly, the legitimate voice of the French people, and vowed to rewrite the rules of the kingdom. This was the moment the middle class turned from frustrated participants into revolutionary actors. Once the group meant to stabilize the system declares the system illegitimate, collapse becomes a matter of when, not if. Street unrest exploded. The storming of the Bastille signaled that institutional control had shattered. As moderates floundered, radicals, especially the Jacobins, seized the public imagination, offering simple solutions to complex crises. The king's execution in 1793 was not the triumph of democracy, but the prelude to the Reign of Terror, where 40,000 died in a frenzy of ideological purging. And when the blood finally dried, France was not free, it was ruled by Napoleon, a military strongman who replaced royal absolutism with imperial domination. France proves the pattern. Inequality, incompetence, and institutional collapse do not produce liberation. They produce chaos, and the kind of leaders who rise from chaos are rarely the ones who promise freedom. If France revealed the first clear outline of the revolutionary pattern, then Russia in 1917 carved that outline into stone. The French Revolution showed how inequality and institutional decay could topple a monarchy. Russia demonstrated how those same forces, when combined with military disaster and a disciplined revolutionary movement, could collapse not just a government but an entire civilization. In other words, if France was the template, Russia was the warning that the pattern does not merely repeat, it escalates. By 1917, the Russian Empire was vast, ancient, and seemingly immovable. Stretching across continents, commanding 180 million people, and ruled by the Romanovs for 3 centuries, it projected an image of endurance. But, as with France, the grandeur was a facade wrapped around a decaying core. Most Russians were peasants who had been freed from serfdom in 1861, yet remained bound to noble estates through debt and backbreaking rents. In cities, workers crowded into dangerous factories, laboring 12-14 hours a day for wages that barely kept starvation away. The empire's elites, meanwhile, floated above this misery, insulated by palaces, feasts, and opulence that belonged to another century entirely. The social divide was not merely wide, it was medieval. And again, as in France, the rot at the bottom was matched by paralysis at the top. Tsar Nicholas II was a monarch tragically unsuited to the era he lived in. Convinced that God himself had chosen him to rule, he resisted reform even as the empire crumbled beneath him. His regime's brutality on Bloody Sunday in 1905, when peaceful protesters were massacred outside the Winter Palace, destroyed whatever trust remained between the people and their ruler. From that moment, the question was no longer whether Russia would break, but when. World War I provided the answer. Russia's entry into the conflict was a catastrophe on every level. Soldiers marched to the front without boots, rifles, or ammunition. Entire divisions were slaughtered or surrendered. By 1917, millions were dead, millions more wounded, and the army itself was disintegrating. Hunger ravaged the cities. Inflation surged. Factories collapsed. Meanwhile, the Tsar placed his trust not in generals or statesmen but in Rasputin, a wandering mystic whose influence over the royal family became a national scandal and symbol of governmental insanity. The breaking point came in February 1917 when bread riots erupted in Petrograd. When troops were ordered to fire on the crowds, they refused and then joined the protesters. The moment the army switched sides, the autocracy evaporated. The Duma demanded the Tsar's abdication, and Nicholas II stepped down, ending 300 years of Romanov rule with a signature rather than a siege. Yet the provisional government that replaced him repeated the fatal errors of the old regime. It stayed in the war, failed to address hunger, and offered promises instead of solutions. Public trust, already thin, dissolved entirely. Into this vacuum stepped the Bolsheviks. Led by Lenin, they wielded discipline, ideology, and simplicity. Peace, land, bread. Their October takeover was swift, almost bloodless, but what followed was anything but. The civil war between Reds and Whites annihilated millions. The Checha's terror campaigns silenced dissent. By the time the Bolsheviks emerged victorious, Russia had not been reborn, it had been shattered and rebuilt into a one-party dictatorship. Under Stalin, the death toll soared even higher. Russia's collapse confirms the pattern with brutal clarity. When extreme inequality, incompetent leadership, and institutional breakdown intersect with military failure and an organized revolutionary vanguard, the result is not reform, it is total systemic implosion. And the aftermath is rarely freedom. It is the kind of darkness that takes generations to escape. If France revealed the origins of the revolutionary pattern, and Russia demonstrated its catastrophic power when fused with military collapse, then Cuba in 1959 shows something even more unsettling, that the pattern can strike not only ancient monarchies or sprawling empires, but modern, semi-prosperous nations that believe themselves safely anchored in the 20th century. In other words, Cuba proves that technological progress, tourism revenue, and glittering urban skylines cannot inoculate a society against the same sequence of inequality, corruption, radicalization, and collapse. The pattern adapts, it waits, and when the right combination of pressures emerges, it awakens again. In the 1,950 seconds, Cuba did not look like a country on the verge of revolution. It had one of the highest living standards in Latin America. Havana, with its neon casinos, bustling clubs, and steady flow of American tourists, projected glamour rather than instability. U.S. Investment poured into hotels, industry, and the sugar trade. To outsiders, Cuba appeared modern, lively, and full of possibility. Yet, as in France and Russia, the shine on the surface concealed fractures beneath fractures, widening faster than the elites realized. The prosperity of Havana was not shared by the rest of the island. Wealth flowed upward into the hands of a narrow elite connected to President Fulgencio Batista, while rural Cuba, especially in the eastern provinces, remained impoverished and ignored. The economy was dominated by sugar plantations, many owned by foreign corporations or Cuban oligarchs. Profits rarely stayed in local communities. Healthcare, education, and infrastructure were limited or non-existent outside major cities. In short, Cuba embodied the same explosive contrast seen in earlier revolutions: glittering privilege concentrated in one place and widespread deprivation everywhere else. But Cuba's slide toward revolution was not driven by inequality alone. Batista's government was a masterclass in corruption and authoritarian decay. His 1,952 coup overthrew democratic elections and replaced them with rule by decree. Courts bent to political pressure. Police were instruments of fear, bribery, and torture. Journalists were silenced. Opponents disappeared. American mobsters ran Havana's casinos with Batista's blessing, their profits protected by the regime. The state no longer even pretended to serve its people, it existed to enrich itself and punish dissent. This environment radicalized a new generation of educated Cubans, including a young lawyer named Fidel Castro. Outraged by Batista's corruption, Castro launched the ill-fated Moncada barracks attack in 1953. Though it failed, his fiery courtroom speech, "History will absolve me," transformed him into a symbol of moral resistance. After imprisonment and exile, he returned with 82 men aboard the yacht Granma. Most were killed or captured, but a few survivors slipped into the Sierra Maestra mountains. What should have been the end of a small rebellion instead became the beginning of a revolution, because Batista responded with escalating brutality. Villages suspected of helping rebels were burned. Civilians were beaten, tortured, and killed. Each abuse pushed more Cubans, especially the young and educated, toward Castro's cause. As domestic legitimacy collapsed and U.S. support evaporated, the Batista regime unraveled. By late 1958, soldiers deserted, officers fled, and the government began to implode from within. On the 1st of January 1959, Batista fled the island with hundreds of millions of dollars. Days later, Castro entered Havana to roaring crowds, promising democracy, justice, and freedom from corruption. But, as the pattern warns, revolutions rarely deliver what they promise. Castro quickly centralized power, executed political enemies, silenced the press, and transformed Cuba into a communist dictatorship that endured for 6 decades. Middle-class supporters who had dreamed of reform found themselves living under a new form of repression, harsher and more enduring than the old. Cuba proves a critical point. Even modern nations, even seemingly stable, prosperous societies can collapse into revolution when inequality, corruption, and institutional failure converge. The pattern doesn't care about the century. It only cares about the conditions. France revealed the pattern's birth, Russia exposed its devastating scale, and Cuba proved its ability to strike even modern societies. But the true power of these stories emerges only when they are brought together. After recounting 3 revolutions across 3 centuries, the text distills their shared structure into something stark and unmistakable, a 6-stage blueprint that transcends geography, ideology, and era. By this point in the narrative, the reader is no longer looking at isolated historical catastrophes, but at a single process repeating itself like a warning bell echoing through time. The first stage is extreme wealth inequality, the silent architecture beneath every revolution. In France, aristocrats hoarded tax exemptions while peasants starved. In Russia, nobles lived like medieval lords, while serfs remained trapped in poverty. In Cuba, a glossy, Americanized elite indulged in Havana's casinos, while rural families lacked schools and medicine. Inequality by itself does not ignite the revolution, but it lays the emotional and structural groundwork, especially when luxury is flaunted in the face of suffering. Revolutions do not erupt from hunger alone, but from insult, from humiliation, from the visible reminder that the system is designed for someone else's benefit. Stage 2 is government corruption and incompetence, the point where the populace stops believing that reform is possible. Louis XVI could not decide or lead. Nicholas II clung to divine right illusions. Batista drowned his country in bribery, repression, and criminal partnerships. In each case, the government served a narrow elite, domestic or foreign, while neglecting its own people. Authority that cannot solve problems, or refuses to, becomes authority that no one respects. And once respect collapses, loyalty follows. Stage 3 marks the radicalization of the middle class, arguably the most pivotal moment in the entire sequence. Revolutions begin not when the poorest rise up, they rarely have the time, tools, or networks, but when the people who should be thriving instead feel betrayed. Lawyers, merchants, students, small business owners, those who expected upward mobility and received stagnation or repression instead. These are the organizers, the writers, the agitators, the ones capable of transforming anger into movement. When the middle class turns against the system, the center of gravity shifts, reform becomes unlikely, upheaval becomes certain. Stage 4 is the collapse of institutional legitimacy, the point of no return. Courts no longer deliver justice, elections no longer feel real, parliaments no longer represent the public, the military fractures, and religious or cultural institutions lose trust. Even if authority still exists on paper, it has lost its meaning. The contract holding society together dissolves. Stage 5 is the rise of a revolutionary movement with mass support. These movements succeed not because their ideologies are compelling, but because their slogans are simple. Peace, land, bread, justice, punish the corrupt. In every revolution, people support the radicals not because they admire them, but because they despise the existing regime more. Hope and hatred merge into momentum. Stage 6 is the overthrow of the old order and the chaos that follows. This is where the revolution devours the moderates, elevates extremists, and replaces corruption not with freedom, but with purges, civil war, and dictatorship. France had the terror, Russia the Cheka and the Gulag, Cuba the executions and one-party rule. The promise of liberation dissolves into blood, fear, and centralized power. This six-stage pattern, repeated with eerie precision across centuries, is what turns history from story into warning. If the six-stage pattern is the lens through which the past becomes legible, then the text's next move is its most provocative. It turns that lens toward the present. Having shown how France, Russia, and Cuba marched down the same narrowing corridor of inequality, corruption, radicalization, and collapse, the author now argues that the United States in 2025 is already deep inside that very corridor 4 steps in, with only the most volatile stages remaining. Whether one accepts the claim or not, the rhetorical strategy is clear. The past is not offered as distant memory, but as a mirror, and the reflection staring back is uncomfortably familiar. The argument begins with Stage 1, extreme wealth inequality, the foundation beneath every revolution in the model. But here, instead of aristocrats or nobles, the villains are statistical curves and financial distributions. Since 1980, the wealth share of the top 1% has surged to roughly 1/3 of all American wealth. A microscopic 0.1% supposedly owns more than the bottom 90% combined. And unlike France in 1789 or Russia in 1917, where the elite's excess was hidden behind palace walls, modern inequality parades itself in real time. Private jets streak across Instagram feeds, mega yachts become viral spectacles, billionaires launch themselves into space while ordinary Americans struggle to pay for rent, medical bills, or higher education. Inequality, in this framing, isn't just economic. It's cinematic, visible, taunting. From there, the narrative moves to Stage 2, government corruption and incompetence, not through monarchs or warlords, but through collapsing trust. Polls show Congress with approval ratings near historic lows. The Supreme Court is increasingly perceived as partisan. Many citizens believe elections are rigged, manipulated, or shaped by dark money and corporate interests. Insider trading scandals involving lawmakers, legislation drafted by lobbyists, and legislative paralysis all reinforce the impression that government functions as a service industry for donors rather than a representative institution for citizens. The text does not claim universal agreement on these points. Instead, it emphasizes perception. and in revolutionary dynamics, perception is often more explosive than reality. Stage 3. The radicalization of the middle class arrives in the form of a generation that followed the rules but finds the promised rewards slipping out of reach. Degrees earned, careers pursued, hours worked, and yet student debt suffocates, housing prices skyrocket, and wages fail to keep pace with costs of living. These are not the poorest Americans. They are teachers, nurses, engineers, analysts, people who expected to thrive. And when those who expected stability instead feel betrayed, the narrative argues, they begin searching for culprits, explanations, and alternatives, including more radical ideologies. All of this, the text claims, has delivered the United States to stage 4, loss of faith in institutions, the point of no return in the model. Trust in media has fractured. Trust in police is polarized. Trust in elections is split down the middle. One half of the nation believes the 2020 election was stolen. The other half believes January 6th was an attempted coup. Courts, bureaucracies, and federal agencies are increasingly seen as political combatants rather than neutral arbiters. America, the argument suggests, now resembles two nations occupying the same territory, sharing geography but not a reality. And as with France, Russia, and Cuba, all it takes within this narrative is a spark. A contested election, a market crash, a viral incident amplified across millions of screens. The text insists we are not watching history from a distance. We are standing inside its machinery. If the text's application of stages 1 through 4 to the United States is meant to unsettle, its final step is meant to alarm. Having argued that America is already deep inside the revolutionary pattern, the narrative now turns to the two remaining stages, 5 and 6, not as present realities, but as looming shadows. The rhetorical purpose is clear: to show that if history's script continues unaltered, the last acts are the most violent, the most unrecognizable, and the least forgiving. By placing these stages just beyond the reader's horizon, the text intensifies the sense of approaching danger. Stage 5, the rise of revolutionary movements with mass support, is described not as something that has fully arrived, but as something gestating beneath the surface. The narrative paints a polarized landscape in which the political center is eroding from both sides. On the left, it identifies growing enthusiasm for socialist ideas, wealth redistribution, and increasingly militant rhetoric surrounding economic justice. On the right, it highlights rising support for strongman figures, suspicions that the system is fundamentally corrupted, and calls for extra-legal or extraordinary measures. According to the text, neither side represents a coherent revolutionary army. Rather, they represent fertile emotional terrain. The more moderates lose their influence and institutional legitimacy erodes, the more susceptible the public becomes to voices offering simple answers and clear enemies, just as Jacobins filled the vacuum in France, Bolsheviks in Russia, and Castro's movement in Cuba. But it is stage 6, overthrow and chaos, where the text deploys its most dramatic imagery. The narrative sketches a hypothetical future in which political violence escalates beyond sporadic unrest into coordinated attacks, assassinations, or insurgencies. It imagines institutions fracturing under pressure, police departments splitting in loyalty, military units disagreeing on legitimacy, and state governments challenging federal authority. In this scenario, supply chains falter, trust in the economy collapses, and foreign competitors exploit the turmoil. The United States that emerges from such a sequence, the text argues, may not resemble its former self. It could harden into authoritarianism, fragment into regional blocs, or transform into something entirely new, something darker, born not from ideology, but from crisis. Importantly, the text offers a brief glimmer of hope. Perhaps reform could avert such an outcome. Perhaps awareness of the historical pattern could interrupt it, but this hope is deliberately faint, almost perfunctory. The narrative immediately dims it by invoking the weight of precedent. The pattern says otherwise. In France, Russia, and Cuba, elites believed their nations were exceptions. They believed their institutions were too strong, their people too divided, or their traditions too enduring for collapse to reach them. Each time, the author insists they were wrong. The piece concludes with a flourish characteristic of modern long-form media, a call to subscribe. This closing move is not merely promotional, it reinforces the narrator's position as guide, interpreter, and sentinel, the one who will continue explaining the unfolding pattern as the storm clouds darken. It leaves the reader with the sense that the story is not finished, that the next stage has not yet arrived, but could, at any moment.
History leaves clues before it leaves ruins. If this story made you question where we truly stand in the pattern, share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective matters. And if you found real value here, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next.